Hey guys, this is Greg Jones or 0sum79 for dragthebar.com, and today I'm going to be bringing you the second video in the Tools of the Trade series called Understanding ICM Explorer. So you may be asking yourself, what is ICM Explorer? ICM Explorer is a piece of software that not a lot of people know about, but it's becoming a little bit more popular. It's a tool that allows us to mathematically calculate the equity that we need based on ICM tax. So there are some calculators out there that people can use for cash games that allow you to look at the equity you need in different situations. But for sit and goes, we also need to take into account the ICM tax. And because of that, having a specialized tool that lets us do this is useful. Another cool thing about ICM Explorer is that it can solve problems that Sit and Go Wizard can't solve. This includes post-flop play type things and mathematical calculations. So it's a really valuable piece of software to have in your arsenal when you're learning how to play sit and goes. Rather than producing a range of hands that you should play like Sit and Go Wizard does, ICM Explorer produces an equity calculation, which combined with an equity calculator like Poker Stove, we can use to actually get hand ranges. So it's a pretty neat tool because it's going to tell us exactly mathematically what we need for a lot of things that Sit and Go Wizard keeps hidden. It's also invaluable since it helps studying the different equities that you need in different situations in the tournament, and to get a sort of deeper understanding of the ICM tax. This is really going to be helpful on the bubble and some of the other tough spots that people get into. So it's a really useful tool for looking at bubble examples. I think that when you're learning any software, it's a lot easier to sort of dive into some examples rather than trying to go through and highlight the different features of the software, because learning by doing examples means you're going to find where all the buttons are naturally anyways, and it's going to show you also how powerful the software is. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover 4 examples in this lesson where we use the ICM Explorer to look at some different unique and tough situations that are common for sit and go players. So it sounds like it's worth taking a look at this software. Alright, in example number 1, we want to know what's the equity that we would need to call if we're on the bubble. So we're going to look at a bubble situation where everybody's 11 blinds deep, we're in the big blind, and the small blind is shoving into us. And the question that we're going to ask uniquely is, how much equity do we need to call? So we'll go ahead and pull ICM Explorer over, and we're going to look at a bubble situation. So the first thing you'll see is there's a ton of buttons on this. There's a couple of really nice hotkeys. One is this level 1 button, which allows it to be in the format that you'll see here, where we've got 1,500 chips distributed evenly at the 10-20 blind level. Another one is one where we'll hit this bubble button, and you'll see that it'll redistribute the chip stacks evenly, and it automatically sets the blind level to 200, 400. So you can see in this left column we've got the caller selection tab, and in the right column we've got the better selection tab, and this is going to allow us to figure out who's doing the action and who's having to call. Now let's look at a situation where we've got sort of a little bit of strange stacks. We want to look at a situation where everybody's got about 10 blinds or 11 blinds. So here you can see that these stacks would be less than 10 blinds. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 300, 150. And we said that the small blind was shoving into us and we were looking at calling from the big blind. So here you can see that we've set the blinds, and we would be the caller in the big blind, and the better would be the small blind here. So the question is, how much equity do we need to call a shove? Hit this call push button, and you can see that we need about 61.39% equity to call a shove here. Now the chip odds that we need are only 45.56. Typically you can't get better than 50% chip odds. So there's a little bit of pot odds involved here since there's some extra chips in the pot already, which reduces that from 50% to 45%. So this is giving us basically the straight number calculation of what we would need to call. Now, if we want to go back and sort of retrieve what the sit and go wizard ranges would be, we can look at some different situations. Like let's say we're sitting in the big blind holding pocket sevens, and the question is, should we call? Well, let's make an assumption first that maybe the small blind is shoving pretty widely, and you know, and sort of trying to exploit the fact that we should be risk averse on the bubble. So we'll go ahead and pull over a poker stove here, and we'll remember that the equity that we needed was 61.39%. So I'm going to go ahead and assign a pretty wide shoving range, sort of a reckless shoving range to this guy, like about 77%. And then we can go ahead and we can plug in pocket sevens for ourselves. And we go ahead and hit the evaluate button, and Poker Stover is going to give us an answer. It's going to give us the equity that we have with our hand versus this sort of perceived range of the small blind shover. And you can see here that it gives us about 62.5%. So that's easily enough equity to call, because ICM Explorer told us we only needed 61.39. And the other question was, what about with King 9 offsuit? You can go ahead and just change this from pocket sevens to King 9 offsuit. You can see here that this is not going to be above 61.39%. And so with a hand like King 9 offsuit, we should not call. And it's a little bit less intuitive than Sit and Go Wizard, because Sit and Go Wizard, we would just sort of set player 2's range, or even it might auto set it for us based on the chip stacks. But here we can use some of the better reads that we've got and go through the mathematics on our own. ICM Explorer gives us the same result plus a whole lot more information. All right, now this is a fairly common spot that I've had a lot of students get into. It involves playing ace-king offsuit when we've sort of missed the flop and the turn, and we're trying to decide whether we should bluff or not. So let's say we're in a situation where we're early in the tournament, the blinds are at 100, 200, and there's still a lot of people left, and we've raised to 225 chips and been called by the button. So we're raising from like a middle position place. And then we miss the flop, but we go ahead and we continuation bet on the flop, and we get called again by button. Then the turn doesn't improve our hand, so we check, and the button checks. And now on the river, we're trying to decide whether we should bluff. And we need to know how often a bluff needs to work. So this isn't just going to be based on chip odds. We're going to have some ICM tax involved, since we're going to get knocked out of this tournament. And ICM Explorer can help us to solve this problem. So the question is, how often does a bluff on the river need to work? We'll go ahead and we're going to pull this back over, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the level 1 button. You'll see everybody resets to 1500 chips. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in the 100, 200 blinds. And we're saying that the caller is the button. And we're saying that we're doing the betting from maybe like middle position. And now we need to go ahead and we need to get the chip stacks right. So there are some interesting things down here we need to look at. One is this bets boxes in the bets column need to be filled in. So we said we bet 225 on the flop and 400 on the turn. So that's going to be 625 chips have gone into the pot from our stack, and 625 chips have gone into the pot from the button stack. And now we're trying to decide whether we want to bluff the river. So you see this bluff button down here, and you see this bet box up here. Now we could go ahead and we could back calculate what amount of chips we've got left, but actually ICM Explorer is smart enough. If we just go ahead and hit the bluff button, you're going to see that it says we're going to be giving up 875 chips. That's the 875 that's already in the pot. If we just set this bet to 10,000, then it's going to basically put the rest of our chips into the pot. So ICM Explorer spits out a result that our bluff needs to work enough that we are called less than 59% of the time. So the maximum amount of calls allowed is 59.77%. So actually, you can see it's kind of interesting. This is pretty profitable on a pure bluff on the river here. Our bet only needs to work about 40% of the time, just a little more than, or we can get calls up to 40% of the time, and this will still work. So this is a pretty interesting one. Now let's think about the other option here, which would be, let's say we played a little less passively. Instead of checking behind on the turn, we decide to go ahead and semi-bluff the turn by shoving. So let's say now, let me pull this over to the side here. Let's say instead we're trying to decide whether we should semi-bluff on the turn. How often does that need to work? So there's another button on here called semi-bluff, which is pretty interesting. Instead of hitting the bluff button, which would basically mean that we don't have any equity left, we're just on a stone cold bluff, we can semi-bluff. And if we hit this, the one thing we need to calculate here is what's the percentage of the chance that we're sort of going to improve our hand. Now, let's just assume, for example, that if we hit our ace or our king in this hand, we're going to improve. That gives us 6 outs, right? And by the rule of 2, we can multiply, because we're on the turn, we can multiply 6 by 2, and that's 12. So we've got 12% equity from our draw. And then I would also say that maybe our ace-high hand has a little bit of equity because the guy played pretty passively on the turn too, checking behind. So we don't necessarily think that villain has the greatest hand, so maybe our ace-high has a little bit of extra equity. I'd go ahead and I'd say maybe we've got 15% total equity, somewhere between 15 and 20% total equity. And now, instead of hitting the bluff button, we're going to hit the semi-bluff button. You're going to see that with calls allowed at 15% equity, now our semi-bluff on the turn only needs to work, we can be called up to 74% of the time to still be profitable, which means that we only need to get folds around 25% of the time for this to be a profitable semi-bluff on the turn. And so I would say that if you're going to evaluate these two plays of checking behind on the turn or shoving the turn, that it looks like shoving the turn is more profitable because the player needs to fold less often. But it's a little bit more complicated than that because, you know, the villain is going to have had a chance to see their hold hand and consider folding on the river, knowing they're not going to improve any further, whereas on the turn they may decide to call because they're also drawing as well. So this is going to depend heavily on the board texture as far as whether we would want to check behind on the turn or not. But this is a really neat problem because I have a lot of people ask me in lessons, you know, what happened? I continuation bet the flop, and now on the turn I'm stuck and I'm trying to decide whether I should just shove or whether I should check it down or whether I should check and shove the river. And this gives us some different numerical calculations we can use to see which how profitable those options are going to be and how often we need to get villains to fold. And the surprising result is actually that I would say semi-bluffing the turn doesn't need to get a lot of folds to actually be a pretty profitable spot. So, you know, when you get stuck in these kind of tough situations, sometimes we have better tools than Sit and Go Wizard to actually look at it. And that's, I guess, one of the most powerful things about ICM Explorer is it can help us to look at some situations that are post-flop rather than just shove-fold. All right. Example number 3. We're trying to decide whether we should make a river call or not. And let's say we're in a situation where we've got 7-2 suited on the bubble, and the blinds are at 100, 200. We're in the big blind, and there's 4 stacks. 500 is the under the gun stack. The button has 3,000. Small blind has 5,500, and us, the hero, have 4,500 chips in the big blind. We think the small blind is kind of a wild, loose player, and that player limps the small blind, and we check. So now we've each put 200 chips into the pot. The flop comes down 3 of hearts, 3 of diamonds, 6 of clubs, and villain checks. So we check behind because obviously our hand has not improved, and we have no strong draws. On the turn, the 6 doesn't improve our hand, and we both check again. And then the river comes a 7, giving us a pair of 7s and a pair of 6s. And there's 2 pair on the board. And the river, the sort of wild, loose villain, bets 400 chips. And we could sort of assume that maybe this villain would be doing this, seeing that there's 2 pair on the board, 6s and 3s. Maybe villain's got an ace high or a king high and thinks their hand is good, is trying to squeeze a little extra value out of this hand. And we're trying to decide with our 2 pair of 7s and 6s, which beats the board, whether we should go ahead and call a 400 chip bet. So this is a pretty easy one to do with ICM Explorer. We'll go ahead and we'll go back to the bubble. I'm going to click down here on the bubble. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the chip stacks in. And we're going to put in our 4,500, our 5,500 of the small blind. Notice down here, this isn't actually calculating the chips in real time, but it will eventually autocorrect. So we need to have, the button has 3,000. And the blinds were at 100, 200, so we put in our big blind. The small blind limped, so they put in 200. And you can see now the caller and better have been reset. And we're trying to decide now whether we should call a river bet. So we're going to change this bet box from 10,000 to 400. And that's basically saying that this bettor is betting 400 into us on the river. And, how often should we call? Or what equity do we need to call? And I'll go ahead and I'll hit this call bet. And now it's telling us that we need to be getting approximately 34.9% equity. Notice that with 400 chips in the pot, and with the bettor betting 400 chips on the river, we're getting exactly 2 to 1. So you can see the chip odds here are 33%. That's 2 to 1. We only need to be getting to win 1 out of 3 times to be getting good chip odds. But here the ICM tax is actually pretty low. And the reason why is because we're not calling our whole stack. We're not at risk of getting eliminated from the tournament. And we've got a fairly big stack. So that 400 chips isn't going to have a huge ICM premium. You can see down here this risk premium, 1.6%, is exactly what the difference between these chip odds and the equity needed numbers are. And so you can see that the risk premium here is pretty low. And we only need to win about 1 in 3 times. So the thing that we can learn from this example from ICM Explorer is that here we would probably want to make a call, because I would say 1 in 3 times against a wild player betting this 2 pair on the board, that our higher 2 pair is going to be better. Now I wouldn't say that we're in such a good situation we want to re-raise. With the board double paired, it's possible that this guy was sort of slow playing a higher pocket pair, but concerned about it, like maybe the guy had 8s, or maybe the guy hit trips and was slow playing it, trying to get value out of us since we were being really passive. It's hard to know exactly, so I do think that Villain still has some equity in this pot, but I think we're going to win 1 in 3 times easily. I think we're going to win 34.93% of the time easily, so making the call here would be correct. All right. Now the last example, this is a pretty interesting example. It actually came from my Crushing Online Sit and Go's book originally, from one of the video examples, but it's a really good one, and so I wanted to put it in here last because it's a play that I think people a lot of times don't think about, and also maybe they overvalue their hand a little bit. Plus, Sit and Go Wizard doesn't give you the option of trying to decide whether you should induce shoves. It only tells you whether shove's profitable. So this is a really fun one to do. It'll be a good one to close out the video with. Let's say Hero holds pocket queens and is sitting on the button, and the blinds are at 100, 200 plus a 25 chip ante. And I've gone ahead and put the stacks down here. I'm not going to read them all out, but we're sitting in the button, so we've got 2,500 chips, and we're trying to decide whether we should open shove this hand into the big blind, or whether we should just go ahead and make a small raise, hoping that the big blind's going to try to shove over us. So we think that the big blind, we've got a read on the big blind that they're kind of laggy, tight on the laggy side, but with a VPIP of 19, a preflop raise of 16, and a high aggression factor. So somebody that probably, if they have a decent hand, is going to go ahead and re-steal. Now the way that I sort of like to look at these guys' re-stealing ranges is I'll look at the PFR, preflop raise, and I'll cut that number in half. And I'll say, okay, well, they're probably going to 3-bet over us in situations like this with about half of their preflop raise range. So here, based on these stats, I'd say, well, Villain's likely to re-raise with 8% of their stack, or 8% of their holdings. And we know that shoving pocket queens from the button here is going to be highly profitable for about 10 big blinds. So the question is, is inducing more profitable? And that would be by by hero raising to 500 chips and hoping that the big blind would shove over him. So here, let's go ahead and put the stacks in. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it on this sort of bubble setting, but I'm going to add a fifth stack. And 2,000, 2,500, 2,500, and the blinds are at 200, 100. Now we get a chance to see another one of these buttons, which is the ante button. If you go ahead down here and hit the ante plus 25 button, it's going to add 25 to every stack that we've stuck in there so far, or every bet that we've stuck in there so far. And so now we've got the situation sort of set up correctly, and we want to make sure that we're down here as the bettor, and we're going to go ahead and put in a bet of 500. And we're trying to decide here whether we're going to induce or just shove. And so we hit the steal or induce button. You can see that it says that the equity that we need to induce action is going to be 67.09%, meaning our pocket queens have to be better than 67% for this to work. Otherwise, it's not going to be a profitable. It's not going to be profitable to induce here. So now we'll go ahead and pull out our poker stove again. And let's go ahead and put villain on an 8% range. Except typically in sit and goes, I don't think of guys as having these hands in their range as much as I think of having like an ace-10 offsuit. So 8% would look exactly like this: ace-10, ace-10 suited, and pocket eights. And we're trying to decide here whether we want to play queens. So let's go ahead and look at the equity that queens are going to have against this guy. And you can see here that even a hand as strong as pocket queens does not have enough equity to try to induce here, because if we get our pocket queens in, we're only going to have 63% equity. And here ICM Explorer told us we need 67% equity for this to be profitable. Now, what about pocket kings? So it's pretty easy. Now that we've done the ICM Explorer calculation, we can just go ahead and swap pocket queens for pocket kings. Go ahead and evaluate again. And here pocket kings have 70% equity. So in this position, we've learned something really useful. We've learned that if we're sort of trying to decide whether to steal or induce with monster hands, there's a pretty big tipping point or inflection point in between pocket queens and pocket kings. So here, going ahead and thinking about inducing with kings would be a reasonable play, but going ahead and inducing with queens is no good, even though queens are very strong. Alright, so as you've seen from the video, ICM Explorer is a really powerful tool. It allows us to look at our post-flop play for things like bluffing, calling bets we think are bluffs on the river, semi-bluffing, all sorts of other really useful stuff. It looks at variations on play, like this last hand where we were trying to decide whether to induce or not, or whether we should be semi-bluffing the turn versus bluffing the river with the ace-king hand. And it also gives us mathematical solutions, like we saw earliest in the video, where we're just trying to find out a numerical calculation that we can then use with Poker Stove to derive the correct play with certain hand ranges. So it's a lot more powerful than Sit and Go Wizard in some ways. Sit and Go Wizard's a lot easier to use than others. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I'd say they're very complementary software, and I'd say you should probably try to go ahead and have both of them on your computer if you're learning how to play Sit and Goes. The great thing about the ICM Explorer is it was designed by a guy named Doug Zare. He's a real nice guy, and he's a really easy guy to donate $20 to. He's done a lot for the Sit and Go community, and he made this really nice software for us. So I would highly recommend that if you like this video and you think that this is something you'd like to use, go to ICMExplorer.com and go ahead and pick this up. There's a PayPal option, so you can just ship $20. No problem. For Euro guys, where the euro is strong against the dollar, this is an extraordinarily cheap investment in in making some really good money playing sit and goes. So I hope you enjoyed the video. This is Greg Jones or 0779 saying good luck at the tables.